We are in a time of realignment. When Republicans propose cuts or reorganization, Democrats are going to show up and give speeches and have a little protest, which I think is delightful. I cannot imagine a better split screen than Chuck Schumer wailing about foreign aid outside of USAID while JD Vance is making things better for the people of East Palestine, Ohio. Am I wrong to just be loving this?
We are in a party that in general has been characterized by weakness, and the left really knows this, and they count on it. So the real purpose of what they do is to stampede us. I guess what I'm saying is our fate is in our own hands.
What do you think the left is going to try over the next 4 years? Is there a particular strategy they might deploy that you say, that could be dangerous, that could be effective?
I think that right now these guys are in complete disarray, and I think... Hey, Matt, how are you?
I'm great, my friend. Thanks so much for doing this. You know,
Absolutely.
I think a lot of people will come to this discussion having seen either your videos or my videos online, and somehow we're in their algorithm. And what I was thinking about our chat, what's most interesting is that my work, for most of what people have seen of me, has had to be constrained to 5 minutes. Because I learned quickly in Congress that was about the only thing they can't take away from you is your 5 minutes. Whereas people have encountered your work in these groundbreaking documentaries, in these best-selling books you've written, in the long-form lectures and pieces you've done. So it'll be my hope is at the end of our discussion, people will know more about your approach to storytelling, and we'll also see my efficacious use of 5-minute blocks. Sound good?
Perfect. Sounds good.
I kind of want to start in the middle with 2000 Mules because that was a raging commercial success for you. Your investors all made a lot of money. You made a lot of money. But you were so dogged after the publishing of that film to try to get it to animate some sort of government action to solve the problem. And now, looking back years later after you published that, how do you analyze not the commercial success, which was all the rage, but just how attorneys general, members of Congress, district attorneys, CISA, DOJ reacted to the way you told the story through the application of this technology? Hey, listen up. The April 15th tax deadline, it's coming fast. Do you have unfiled tax returns? Can't pay the IRS? The IRS is more aggressive than ever. And the longer you wait, the worse this is going to get. Wage garnishments, bank levies, even property seizures are on the table. You need to get ahead of this, and you need to do it right now. But going up against the IRS alone, that is a huge mistake. Take my advice, call the experts at Tax Network USA. They know the system. They have an edge. They even have a preferred direct line to the IRS. They do this all the time, so they know which agents to deal with, and perhaps just as important, which ones to avoid. So whether you owe $10,000 or $10 million, their genius strategies are going to be designed to help quickly settle your tax problems in your favor. Tax Networks USA's attorneys and negotiators have already resolved over $1 billion in tax debt. Tax Network USA can help you too, but you have got to move fast. April 15th is almost here. Talk with one of their strategists today. It's totally free. And you need to stop looking over your shoulder and get this put behind you. Call Tax Network USA at 1-800-958-1000. That's 1-800-958-1000 or tnusa.com/Matt.
The key part of 2000 Mules was using two forms of technology that couldn't really be disputed. The first one is the validity of cell phone geo-tracking, widely used in law enforcement, and the other was surveillance video. And the beauty of it was the surveillance video was taken by the states themselves. So this wasn't video that I made or video that was, shot off of some truck. This was surveillance cameras installed by the various states themselves. So it was very powerful evidence, and it was two independent lines of evidence. If you had only one or only the other, you could still have a movie. But the fact that you had both, with the one sort of reinforcing the other, made it especially powerful. Now, at the same time, a movie is going to stop at some point. And by that, I mean it reaches the water's edge, and then the next step has to be taken by someone else. So, for example, if you do cell phone geo-tracking, it's going to give you, this is the work that True the Vote did, the cell phone IDs of these mules. But a cell phone ID is not a name. If I have your cell phone ID, I don't know it's Matt Gaetz. In fact, it requires law enforcement to unmask that ID and trace it to you, which they can do by going to the cell phone provider. And they have the authority to do it. So what we were saying at the end of the film is we've done what we can. And we've made a strong case. But the next step is for law enforcement to go talk to the mules. Like maybe they'll have some legitimate explanation for what they're doing. Many of them in the middle of the night, looking to the left and right, backpack full of ballots. I mean, I can't,
face covered in masks, with no one around.
Wearing latex gloves and taking photos of the ballot going in the box, right?
Yeah.
So an ensemble of actions that is impossible, really, I think, to explain. But hey, maybe I have a limited imagination. I think the key thing with the film was that, I can understand why the Democratic leaders of these urban areas didn't want to pursue it, right? This was a case where they'd be exposing their own side. But what really was striking to me was the fear that this topic and the film struck in the hearts of mainstream Republicans. They didn't want to touch it. So January 6th and sort of election denialism were both politically radioactive. And so a lot of people were privately very complimentary, but they would take no public notice of the film. And that's really why the film didn't go further, as I think it should have, because our own side didn't want to run with this ball.
And the principal critique when I raised this to folks I knew in jurisdictions that were relevant was, well, Matt, this science around the cell phone technology tracing is very imperfect. And someone could have been at the CVS drugstore 5 blocks away, and Dinesh is deeming them a mule around some sort of Dropbox. And, you hear that and you think that, well, they've checked that every which way. And lo and behold, weeks later, Apple can tell you whether or not you've been within a few feet of a person who they believe has COVID, and they can distribute that to you through the very cell phone. So the exact technology that you used, that law enforcement critiqued, was then being referenced by major technology platforms and major public health enterprises to try to tell you whether or not you might have been exposed to COVID. That must have been deeply frustrating for you.
Well, not to mention, in the January 6th charging documents, there were guys who said, hey, listen, I never went in the Capitol. I was outside the door. And the government goes, no, you weren't. According to your cell phone, you were 10 feet inside the door, not outside the door. So they were relying on being able to identify people with a reasonable degree of precision. Now, when you're dealing with a Dropbox, you don't need precision accuracy to the level of, let's say, 3 feet or even 5 feet. Why? Because True the Vote was using the metric of going to 10 or more Dropboxes. So, the point is, you could say, I take a walk every day, I stop to have a cigarette, and I was, within a few feet of this Dropbox, but it doesn't make me a mule. Well, yeah, but then you got in your car and went to the next Dropbox, and the one after that, and the one after that. So it is the repetition of going from one to the other, and then also going to these nonprofits. So it was very damning. I think this is why the left was so freaked out by the film, because it, unlike some of the earlier allegations of election fraud, which were murky and relied on anomalies. Even Sidney Powell, bless her heart, was, I've got all these affidavits, but the problem with the affidavits is who gave those affidavits? Who are those people? Can you believe what they have to say? This requires further. So the film had the power where it put the viewer in the driver's seat, and it basically said, here's what we have. You take a look. We'll take you to the scene of the crime. You make up your mind. You decide if there's corruption here or not.
Yeah, and I do want to get to, though, the dynamic of fear that set in with a number of Republicans who could have done more around this, because I think it tells a story about where our movement is going and what type of leaders we need to select going forward. For those joining us, I'm talking with Dinesh D'Souza, renowned best-selling author, filmmaker, intellectualist, commentator, husband, father, grandfather, and a good friend of mine. The Republicans who would look at evidence and then say, everyone's being called an election denier. They're getting kicked out of their social clubs. They're getting, removed from their companies and their boards because of these types of things. And it's just easier to not react to that. And then 2000 Mules, then we get this subsequent election cycle where Zuckerberg comes around and says, I'm not going to fund these boxes as much. There becomes political pressure from the grassroots to have chain of custody legislation on these drop boxes in Georgia and signature verification and more of those things. Do you think the film 2000 Mules inspired at least the directionally correct approach in some places around election integrity?
It scared the left. There was a Project Veritas guy who interviewed one of these Democratic officials who runs a big kind of get out the vote operation in Fulton County in Georgia. And they released that video publicly. And this is a guy, I think his name was Joel Gray, if I'm not mistaken. He basically goes, they busted us. He goes, geez, they had cell phone tracking. They identified these mules. He even at one point implied that he may have recognized some of the mules himself. Wow. So he validated the premise of the movie. And I think one of the good things about the film is that even though it didn't lead to the steps I was looking for, the next steps, here's the thing. Once you expose a scheme, it's very difficult to keep doing it, right? If I were to tell you Fort Knox has a back door that's open and some burglars got in there and took a bunch of gold out, there are going to be people looking for that the next time, as they were in 2022 and in 20. So I think the Democrats realized whatever we do, we can't do that scheme again. We're going to have to try something. And that alone, I think, was I think, a very, very helpful for 2024.
And in a lot of ways, it leans into one of Trump's superpowers, and that's the power to force your enemies to reveal themselves in ways that limit their operational capability going forward. And certainly the film did that. So I've got to admit, Dinesh, as much as I've seen your commentary and observed your work, I don't know what led you to this. What brought you into the world of politics and commentary out of academia, where you'd been quite successful previously?
Yeah, I had spent most of my career at these so-called think tanks, American Enterprise Institute, the Hoover Institution. I saw myself as functioning inside of a kind of intellectual ecosystem and addressing other people who inhabited that same ecosystem. If you had asked me in my early career, like, who am I trying to reach? I would say, well, there's this kind of hypothetical, kind of middle of the road guy who is kind of riding the fence between the right and the left. I'm trying to convince that guy to kind of come on over to our side. And I think it was, to some degree, my case with the Obama administration when I realized the kind of gangster politics I was now part of. I realized this is not some debating society. This is really a street fight. And so my career really shifted at that point. A guy named Joe Ricketts, the founder of the Ameritrade Bank, a very successful guy, praised one of my books on Obama, the first one called The Roots of Obama's Rage. And he said, I want this book to get out to 1 million people. And I told him, listen, the book is a big bestseller, but it's a bestseller by virtue of selling 100,000 copies. You cannot sell a hardcover book very easily on politics and sell 1 million copies. Well, he goes, well, how do you reach 1 million people? I go, well, ask Michael Moore, because he made Fahrenheit 9/11. He dropped that in the middle of the 2004 campaign, and it was a massive success. So he goes, well, perhaps you should do that. This was kind of the way I almost crawled backward without really intending to into my career of making films. And it was the right timing. No one had really done it. It broke a lot of new ground. And it paved the way for me to become, in a sense, the conservative answer, hopefully the intelligent alternative to Michael Moore.
And in a lot of ways, the think tanks you talk about have become victim of corporate capture and, frankly, in my mind, foreign capture. Like, I remember being a high school debater, and you'd want to see what was coming out of Hoover or any of these places where commentary on the right or the left or in the center was being percolated. And now you start to see who's giving money to those entities, and they merely become white hat pass throughs for a foreign government to get something published that they want, or a major pharmaceutical company to get published what they want. Was it always that way, or has it just gotten worse in your opinion?
In my view, it wasn't really quite that way, but the structure was there for it to become that way. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I published this very successful book called Illiberal Education, and I hired a speaker's agent. I was invited by hundreds of colleges to go speak. And quite honestly, in those days, it was extremely lucrative because I was getting paid like $5,000 a day. And, I was in my late 20s or early 30s. So I was like, I'll do this, 5 days a week. And so I was bopping around the country, making a bunch of money and debating people and speaking and so on. And then sort of, AEI, which is where I was a scholar at AEI at the time. One of the trustees came to me and said something like, I'll give you $25,000 to speak at, to do these 5 events for me. And I was like, sure, I'd be happy to do it. This is kind of what I'm doing anyway. But I realized that the level of sort of managerial control that went with that as I tried to carry that out was tremendous. And so I suddenly realized, you know what? I'm not really aware of this, but at AEI, even though nobody ever approaches me about this, I am sort of a mendicant. I'm sort of hat in hand. I am at the mercy of these guys who kind of control the gold, and therefore they make the rules. And I've got to remember that is an inherent vulnerability. So although it was very well orchestrated, we would go once a year to Beaver Creek, Colorado, and Henry Kissinger would be there, and Gene Kirkpatrick would be there. I met Gerald Ford. It was kind of a powwow, right? And I tell you something that you'll find very interesting, because we had a round table, and I noticed that a lot of these donor types, corporate guys, were speaking. And I went to the head of AEI and I said, this is very odd. We've got Kissinger, we've got Margaret Thatcher. And I noticed that they're not speaking, but you have some guy from like some bank, lecturing these people about how the world should be organized. Why is that? And he goes, listen, the reason for that is that people don't really come to these events to hear Margaret Thatcher talk to them. They want to go to their friends later and say, as I told Margaret Thatcher. So AEI was accommodating the vanity of these donors who wanted to not only hobnob with the world leaders, but tell them their solution to the problems of the world. So anyway, for me, as a young guy in my early 30s, it was just eye-opening to watch the peculiar. I was almost watching it like an anthropologist, like trying to make sense of what's really going on. But it was a very interesting kind of ecosystem that involved money and politics. And I realized, I'm somehow part of this.
Right, but those were the good old days. Because
those were the good old days.
Those were the good old days that were actually less corrupt than what we have now. Because that was, absolutely. I would far rather appeal to the vanity of donors than to appeal to special interests at home and foreign interests abroad. Because there I arrive in my mid-30s to the United States Congress, looking at places, that I revered. I wanted to pay to be on their email list, even when I didn't have any money, just so I could learn. And then, I see that these Arabia or these Gulf monarchies pour millions of dollars in. I see that defense contractors pour millions of dollars in. I see I see big tech pouring money in. And then you start to say, well, are the thoughts, is the scholarship that emerges a consequence of someone's sincere thinking, or is it just servicing those donor bases? And like, what I know that there are good think tanks and bad think tanks, but if you had to have like a blended aggregate, how much of it do you think is like sincere scholarship, and how much of it is just whoring?
Well, I would say these days, these organizations have very little credibility, and one should be very wary of them. I think that the turning point came with Trump because many of these guys, and these were my colleagues, and so I understand their psychology very well. They're products of the Reagan era, but even in the Reagan era, most of these guys, to be honest, always thought that they were smarter than Reagan. They always thought that they would say things like, oh no, Reagan is meeting with some of the moderates in the Oval Office, as if to say that Reagan is so stupid that the moderates will completely have their way with him unless I am in the room to stop Reagan from falling from this kind of stupidity. So the premise was always that we know better, right? And then they all went against Trump. And over time, it began to dawn on them that they might have taken a wrong turn in the road, but they were so arrogant that they absolutely refused to backtrack at all. Their point was, I must be right. And so they dug in, and by digging in, some of their grassroots support began to dry up. And so then they began to look for alternative sources of funding. I mean, think of what happened to places like National Review, which once had the mainstream support of both the intellectual right, but also the ordinary conservative on the street was like, I like Bill Buckley. I don't understand half of what he's saying, but I know he's on my side and he's a really smart guy. So this was the old arrangement, but it came apart. And I think that these institutions then went in search of new donors to replenish the ranks, the rank and file that no longer supported them.
Oh, that's an interesting progression. I want to talk also about another series of institutions that you're familiar with that have lost credibility, and that's academia. You went to Dartmouth, and I've spent a lot of time on the campus there. I used to go to debate camp in high school every summer at Dartmouth, and summer is definitely the time you want to be there because based on the way those buildings were built, it looked like everybody just sort of had to burrow down in a basement several months out of the year. But I was accepted there. I got a scholarship there, but ultimately ended up going to a state school closer to home. But I know that it must be odd to look back at such a hub of intellectualism and see what it has become now. Do you believe that your grandchildren will look at the Ivy League kind of the same way your children did? Let me tell you a little secret about politics in America. Polling is completely dead. Polling is obsolete, vanquished, and in many ways has been replaced by a lot of the analysis that you see on markets. And you can see that market analysis on Polymarket. Just to think, the Biden Justice Department was going after the CEO of Polymarket a year and a half ago. Now you've got the CEO of Polymarket at the White House with Donald Trump, because this is changing the way people are looking at different prospects, and you need to go and get a Polymarket account. I have a Polymarket account. I love keeping up with the news and seeing how the way I'm informed can end up benefiting me. And if you're going to be informed anyway, if you're going to be taking in all of the smart information, not just the dummy TV, well, then you need a Polymarket account too. That's the way to make sure that, you know what, you can have a little more action riding on the stuff that's cooking in politics, news, sports, entertainment, and it's awesome. Check out Polymarket.
Well, even between my generation and, let's say, Danielle, my daughters, there was a huge change. I would describe it this way. When I was a student in the really 1980 to 1983, those were my years at Dartmouth, the faculty was made up of two groups. There was an older generation of sort of classical liberals. These were Democrats, but they were
The free
Democrats
speech Democrats, the anti-war, free speech, get rid of all the nuclear bombs Democrats.
Right. And then there was a younger radical contingent coming in from the late 60s. These were the young professors. They dressed differently. They spoke differently. They would sometimes use the F word in class, which was unheard of for the earlier generation. But the older generation kind of kept them in check. So there was a good education to be had at Dartmouth if you knew where to find it. Now, by the time that Danielle went to Dartmouth, this is 2013 to 17 now. So fast forward a whole generation, that older cohort had completely gone. retired, passed away, moved on. And so these younger guys were now completely in charge. And so there was a homogeneity of these campuses that didn't exist when I was there. When I was a student, I could have named 25 conservative professors in the Ivy League off the top of my head. Now, I did inhabit that world, but these were all people who are publicly well known and outspoken as right-wingers. Many of them were economists. Some of them, James Q. Wilson at Harvard, Harvey Mansfield, Dartmouth had 5 or 6 of them. So they weren't the majority, but they were at least there. Now, when Danielle was at Dartmouth, I don't think she could name a single one.
Wow.
She was in the Christian Union, and they had a faculty member, but he didn't want his name to be out there. He would sponsor them, but keep my name out of it. And you had to be very careful in deciding which professors to take to even get a liberal education. So I sometimes tell Danielle, like, you're the last liberal arts graduate from the Ivy League, because after you left, basically that education became unavailable. So it's a very sad and in some ways chilling thing that's occurred. But these institutions have completely relinquished their credibility. They've ceased to do what we would call education.
I have hired a lot of people, and I never placed a great deal of credence on those degrees. I often looked at them and thought, well, this is someone who will come to me with no real practical understanding around analysis and research and comparing sources. And like, would you want your granddaughter to go to Dartmouth?
Well, here's the thing. Here's the best thing about these colleges, and it actually has nothing to do with what they teach. When I came to America, I was in a public school in Arizona, and I knew nothing about politics, of course. But when I got to the school, I was absolutely horrified because I felt like I had gone from the 11th grade in India to like the 8th grade. The level of math was so pathetic, so horrible. In fact, I went to my teacher and he goes, "You don't even have to come to class." He goes, "You know everything that I'm going to be teaching." So I thought, wow, the quality of education in America is horrible. But then when I got to Dartmouth, I suddenly realized, no, this is a completely different caliber of student. So the selection process, which relied upon basically, you had to be valedictorian of your class, you need to have high SAT scores, you need to have done 7 other things in the extracurricular domain. These schools were very good at sort of culling out students who were very smart, very thoughtful, had read a lot of stuff. In fact, I'd sit down sometimes in the dining hall my freshman year, and I'd hear these students talking about books, and they'd be talking about Hayek and Milton Friedman, and and who belongs in a liberal society, Dinesh. And I'd be like, you guys have answers. I didn't even know that these were like questions. Who told you to read these books? Like, how have you heard of all these people? I was just blown away by these students, and it began my own journey of like thinking and reading. So it was really more that I was thrilled to be in the company of like the best and the brightest. I haven't even mentioned the professors. It's just the kids who were on the campus at that time. Now, DEI, affirmative action, all the nonsense that has subsequently intervened, I'm not even sure if you could count on that kind of composition or quality of student anymore on an Ivy League campus, but it used to be there.
And we also are just living in a different era of the diffusion of human talent, right? I mean, it used to be the smart people would commingle in particular areas, in particular cities, in particular institutions, but now smart people are everywhere. And as a function of how we're able to have this discussion now and how people will consume it, I think is another threat to the value proposition of some of these places, is that, well, even if the classroom time isn't the most valuable, the people you're going to be around creates that. I don't know if that's really going to be the case. So you talked earlier about the street fight realization you had. And Democrats right now in Congress seem to believe they need a little street theater. And we're seeing the strategy play out where when Republicans propose cuts or reorganization or accountability in a particular agency, Democrats are going to show up en masse outside of that agency and give speeches and have a little protest, which I think is delightful. I cannot imagine a better split screen than Chuck Schumer wailing about foreign aid outside of USAID while J.D. Vance is making things better for the people of East Palestine, Ohio. Or, Donald Trump standing up for Title IX and women being able to play in sports uninhibited, while Maxine Waters is leading some protest outside of the Federal Department of Education. And so, like, I know what's next. They'll be at the FBI next, right? They'll be at, they won't like the fact that we'll propose some reorganization of a farm subsidy, and they'll be outside the USDA. Am I wrong to just be loving this? Because I actually think it shows where their priorities are when they show up outside these government buildings that seem so distant to improvement in people's quality of life.
You are quite right, and I have the same sort of great sense of enjoyment in all this. I do think that you and I temperamentally are not normal in the
That's a fact.
Republican camp. We are in a party that, in general, has been characterized by weakness. It's a party of invertebrates, and the left really knows this, and they count on it. So the real purpose of what they do is to stampede us into a wildebeest style run for the bushes. They're the panther and we're the wildebeest.
Lowercase bushes. We're not running to the other bushes.
That's right. Well, but they want us to scatter, right? A really small but telling example is this irreverent kid from Doge who just got fired. This is a minor victory for the left because they find this kid, they grab onto three things that he said. Actually, the three things that he said are all defensible, but they are all slightly radioactive, right? He goes, I'm only going to marry a member of my own race. So what? Most people do that. Most blacks do that, right? Or he also goes, I want to repeal the Civil Rights Act of 1960. Now, little does he know, there is a very intellectually respectable case for that.
Absolutely.
Because the Civil Rights Act made the horrible mistake, in my view, of outlawing not just public but also private discrimination, which is really inconsistent with a free society. So my point is, nothing that the kid said can't be defended, but someone in a Doge or the administration didn't know that, and they thought, whoops, it's a gotcha, we got to let this kid go. No, this is where I guess what I'm saying is our fate is in our own hands.
Yes.
The other side pulls these maneuvers to get us to freak out and give in. We are used to giving in, but we've got to learn not to give in, at least not to give in so easily, and to recognize that we're the ones actually making the rules right now.
It's such a good point about where we rest within the Republican Party. And I would consider you and I both more on the populist side, but with some pretty strong libertarian tendencies. I mean, particularly during COVID, all of my liberty buddies were really into the information you were putting out. Like, how would you describe your political ideology in the general mosaic that is Republican politics right now?
Well, I do think that we are, as a movement, intellectually a little rudderless. And by that, I mean that preceding Reagan in the 70s, there were very interesting debates that were going on, paleo-conservatives, libertarians, foreign policy types, former communists who had now become anti-communists, and all of these guys congregated at places like the National Review. So there was a lot of intellectual ferment that went alongside Reaganism. I think we need more of that now. In other words, we need a way of trying to rethink what conservatism means in this new era. I mean, obviously, we're not trying to rediscover principles, but we're trying to rediscover how old principles can apply in a completely new situation. So, for example, we're no longer facing a Cold War threat from abroad, but we're facing domestic political opponents who want to trample on our basic civil liberties. And they've, in fact, done it. They've done it unrelentingly for 4 years. How do we deal with that kind of opposition? So I see myself as someone who has made the transformation from the Reagan era to the Trump era, whereas a lot of my kind of old colleagues from the Reagan days simply have not done that. They still echo a warmed over Reaganism, and in fact, they try to deploy those sentiments against Trump.
That's exactly right. And so when you talk about us being rudderless, I would push back and say we are in a time of realignment. And it was easy to understand, what a Republican viewpoint was on foreign policy or on trade or on even free speech, which was, the moral majority wasn't exactly animating free speech values. And now on those major questions, it's not that we've had some subtle nuanced reversion. It is a complete realignment. We are the anti-war party. You go look at the votes in Congress for war. Democrats are providing the most of those votes. They have over the last 4 years pretty consistently. They're the anti-free speech party. They want more free trade. I think that we're more skeptical of that. You see Trump doesn't actually intend to use all the tariffs he threatens. It's obviously a point of leverage that he understands at an economic level in a way a lot of politicians don't. But during that realignment, I do think it's important to have the debates that frame those up, other than obviously your platforms and channels. Like, where do you go to watch the great debates on those questions, to formulate your thinking and your analysis?
Well, I think this is really my point, that I don't know where to go. And here's what I mean.
He went to Texas. He used to be in La Jolla, and he went to Texas looking for it.
No, right. But for other reasons. But look, here's the point. Tariffs. Here's the question. I fully understand that tariffs can be used as a political tool to make Canada or to make Mexico, listen, guys, we'll put some tariffs on you if you don't seal the border, right? But that is not tariffs being used in an economic way, but rather in a diplomatic way. The question is, how effective are tariffs as an economic weapon per se? We used to have them in the 19th century. They were a centerpiece of what America did. There was a powerful kind of libertarian critique of tariffs in the 20th century, people like Milton Friedman. So where do we stand on tariffs per se? Now, turn to foreign policy for a moment. We are the anti-war party, but that is because we have repudiated the preemptive wars of Bush, the underlying false rationale for those wars. But the question becomes, I don't think that we've repudiated Reaganism, because Reagan was actually very careful about deploying troops.
Yes.
Even when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, Reagan refused to deploy American troops. He said, we'll send you some materials, but we're not sending troops. The Reagan doctrine was basically, we don't fight for anybody else's freedom. They have to fight themselves. We might help, but it's their fight. And so Trump, it seems to me, is closer to Reagan than he is, for example, to Bush. But this is a very fertile area for discussion and debate. So yeah, Matt, I mean, I think it would be very productive, and I'm going to maybe play a role in trying to do this, is to organize some summits where these kinds of issues are hashed out. Not so much because we need to refute the left. I think we don't need to do that. But we need to figure out quite clearly where we stand, and also formulate a sort of tradition in which sort of MAGA conservatism is embedded in a longer story of ideas.
You wrote a book in 1995 that got you a lot of criticism, but was terrific, End of Racism. And we're 30 years later. And I wanted to know, as someone who enjoyed the project, what you think about that premise 3 decades later.
The reason for that title, remember I wrote that book in 1995, the year of the OJ verdict.
Right.
It was immediately following the Rodney King riots. So it's not as if I was saying like racism has come to an end. On the contrary, I was really answering the people who said this. They said race matters, and therefore race needs to be a centerpiece of our public policy. That was the prevailing argument. In fact, to some degree, it still is, right?
Yeah.
On the left.
Well, that's I think why I find it interesting, because literally you dissect the intellectual underpinning of DEI on the heels of the OJ verdict, when the thrust of the defense was to acquit a man because of a racist institution. And now, instead of the racist institution being the LAPD, it's all of us. It's you're a racist, I'm a racist. Throw a rock, you'll hit a racist. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I think you're right over the target there.
No, exactly. I think that at that time we saw this. DEI was then just called affirmative action, or the other phrase that was commonly used was proportional representation. In my earlier book, I had kind of made famous the term political correctness. I didn't invent it, but I heard it. And once I put it out there, it kind of caught a wind. The New York Times review of my book said, I think it was called The Rising Hegemony of the Politically Correct. And that's really what set that phrase into the public culture. But the point is that I think at that time, we saw these developments as emerging in the academic sector, making their way into the corporate sector. They hadn't metastasized into the full culture. It hadn't gone out where, as you say, everybody's a racist. You can't throw a stone without hitting a racist. All of that stuff came later, and DEI came to symbolize all that. But it's amazing if you go back to this book in 1995, how all the concept, the whole intellectual architecture, systematic discrimination, institutional racism, a company, let's say, for example, has, only 7% of blacks, whereas blacks are 13% in the greater Oakland area, so they're presumptively racist. I mean, all this stuff is there. It was all cooked up by really some very malevolent but also pretty cunning people, and it remains shockingly relevant.
Yeah, and racism is real. We witness it. I do not believe it is the prevailing force of our country by any means, or any of these institutions. But it must have been pretty bizarre on the heels of this book for people to accuse you of racism just for you're a not white person writing about these matters of race. Did that surprise you, or did you know that was coming when you were going to publish the piece?
It was one of my first exposures to kind of underhanded politics. There were two prominent black guys who were on the board at the American Enterprise Institute, and both of them resigned over my book. And there was then a front page article in the Wall Street Journal, with all the usual, trumpets and tantrums. The article was in itself kind of funny, but not in a manner that they intended. Two black conservatives, they said, are losing their home, as if they lived at AEI. They're losing their home over this book. But the moment you start probing it, you realize, wait a minute, there's actually a backstory here. And these guys were sort of early versions of Bill Kristol. They were unhappy at AEI. They had found better opportunities on the left. They were using this book as a kind of public relations tactic for them to do this highly publicized break with the right so that they could then start getting very good academic sinecures, well-funded grants, set up their own research centers on racism. The whole thing, it opens your eyes to the way...
It's like Liz Cheneying. Like when you then monetize your departure in this kind of scoffing way.
It was racial entrepreneurship. It was very much a version of what people like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton were doing, and I had exposed that in the book, but it was now occurring right of center because, of course, race can pay the mortgage on both sides of the aisle.
So it's so true. It's sad. It's true. And showing what little progress we've made from 95 to now doesn't exactly make me think we're going to resolve this in the next 30 years. You are the father-in-law to my favorite new member of Congress, Brandon Gill. And I want to give people a little truthful context for this discussion. Brandon Gill had been endorsed by President Trump. He's this brilliant, successful, handsome, energetic guy, the kind of person who usually doesn't have much of a contest to win a congressional seat like this. And he goes into one of these super PAC interviews, and they ask him a real, gotcha question. They said, what member of Congress do you admire and would want to model your service after? And he said, Matt Gaetz. And that group then started spending like millions of dollars against him. And so Brandon went from really a glide path to the nomination to being in a street fight, a door-to-door, grind out every vote. And my favorite tweet of this last election cycle was Dinesh D'Souza out going door to door in like Little Elm, Texas for your son-in-law. And I can only imagine what it must have been like for someone when you knocked on their door, handed them the little palm card, and engaged in retail politics. I love knocking on doors. I do it every election cycle. But as someone who has been in like the highest echelons of intellectual thought around these things, to go to like marching from the mailbox to to ring the doorbell, what was that like? And were there any great experiences from that you'll hold dear?
Well, Brandon he's always wanted to run, but he thought he would run 8 years, 12 years from now. But, the sitting congressman decided not to run, creating an open seat. So we sort of had the little family discussion and we said, listen, by and large, you got to go now, right? If you're this is an open seat, it's your best chance to get in. And Brandon, as you say, was doing great. Then this Never Trump PAC unloads like a couple of $1 million on him. There are commercials running all over Dallas, basically portraying Brandon as like a Chinese spy. He's not really from Texas, he's for defund the police. This was all based upon my film Police State, which was about the abuses of the FBI, but they twisted that into Brandon's for defund the police. So as a family, we decided, let's just go all out against these guys, and so fortunately, Brandon had the resources to fight back. But then as it got into the closing stages, Debbie and I decided, let's go up to Dallas. Debbie's done a lot of this, by the way. I haven't. I'm like, let's go to the parking lot on election day. We'll flag down cars as they come into the lot, hand out literature. So I can't claim to have done a lot of that, but I did a little of it. And I got to say, it was extremely enjoyable, just talking to the man off the street.
Will you do it again? Are you ready for the reelect?
I will. If asked, I will do it again.
I got to tell you, it's my favorite part of the campaign is doing those things. I was never much for the cocktail parties, but when you could go and sort of meet people on their terms and have the discussions, it focuses you on what matters. I wanted to ask you just briefly. I've only got a few minutes left with you. You've been, so good at predicting what's coming. What do you think the left is going to try over the next 4 years? And is there a particular strategy that you think, and we've talked about some of their foolish strategies, but is there a particular strategy they might deploy that you say that could be dangerous, that could be effective?
I think that right now these guys are in complete disarray. And I think they are the reason for their chaos. They keep saying that it's chaos in the second Trump term. But what they really mean is not that it's chaos. What they mean is that this is an organized blitzkrieg on so many fronts. I mean, even when I think back to Reagan was essentially a guy of priorities. Reagan's view was you cannot change the world in 30 ways. You can change it in maybe 3 ways. So let me focus on the Soviet Union. Let me focus on tax cuts. Let me focus on privatization. And I will let the rest of it go. I won't even worry about it. That was the Reagan approach. The Trump approach is the opposite. Attack on every front. And I think the left, which expected to see essentially a Trump circa 2017, is caught off guard. They've also realized that their control mechanisms aren't really working. Maxine Waters showing up at the door and normally that works because people are intimidated. I don't want to be a racist. Yes, ma'am. Go right ahead and so on. So they expect that. They expect us to cave, to break down, to give in. And they've suddenly realized that their lassos over us, which have worked for a long time, we don't want to be policed by them in this way. We refuse to do it. We don't buy their nonsense. We don't even feel as obliged as we once did to refute them. We just ignore them. So they are regrouping. And I don't see an easy path forward for them right now. I think in some ways the baton is in our hands. We should be careful not to drop it, or to hand them an issue that is going to give them a new fuel. But ideologically, I think they are in really bad shape. Their issues are a mess. They cannot openly defend almost anything they stand for.
So you don't see something on the horizon for them, and you say, man, if they got behind Gavin Newsom and really got rolling in 2028, we'd be worried. Or if they get Michelle Obama back in politics, there's nothing on the horizon that you say this worries me with them. I get the disarray.
Yeah, I'm not looking at the personality so much as I'm just looking at the issues. I mean, Take something like January 6th. Think of all the effort that they put into propagandizing that one issue, right? And yet when Trump did the pardons, they didn't say, they could have said, why are you pardoning these violent insurrectionists who tried to overthrow the country? No, they had to back up and say, well, we found one guy who was, extremely violent with the cops. Why did you pardon him? As if to say, we kind of understand why you pardoned all the others, but you shouldn't have pardoned, this dude. He's a really bad guy. So that showed you that even on that issue, which was such a, as they saw it, winning issue for them, they had to back up and choose a very fallback line of defense, which actually conceded that the vast majority of January 6 guys are nonviolent. They didn't harm anything. They were excessively prosecuted. And so Trump was like, I'm going to pardon not some of them, not a case-by-case review. I'm pretty much going to pardon all of them except for a couple of commutations over here. So the trans issue, the left is in complete disarray because they cannot openly defend anymore what they used to stand for. So now they have a challenge. Are we going to give up on that issue, detach it from the LGBTQ? So we're now just LGB and full stop, It's hard for them to work their way through all this stuff. And so
We've got a bunch of the gay men. We're not giving the gay men back. The gay men came our way. There's probably a bunch of, I don't know that we got every pit bull adopting lesbian. Not that there's anything wrong with being a lesbian or adopting pit bulls, but I don't know that we crushed it in that demographic. But I don't even know that they get the G.
No, and even some of the people they do have, like for example the scolding Karen, the person who comes up to you in the grocery store and asks you why you aren't wearing a mask. That kind of personality only thrives in an environment where they are given the kind of power to intimidate other people because they're not strong themselves. They rely on the scolding attitude. It's similar to the scold of the old village, square, where someone come up to you and say, I was looking in your window and guess what I saw? They have to rely on that statement striking fear in you, where you go, what did you see? What did you see? Please, don't tell anybody else. That mentality, if we deprive that person of their power, then they won't see the same level of joy in being a kind of national scold.
I want them to. I want our movement to be so successful and prosperous and unifying that even the scolding Karen comes our way. Dinesh, where can people follow your work and see what's coming next in all that you've got in the pipeline?
I do a daily podcast, audio and video, the Dinesh D'Souza podcast. If you look for it, you'll find it. Working on an interesting and somewhat different film project for 2025, and also working on a new book idea for the fall. So I'm hatching some new stuff. I actually love being outside the government because I like being a kind of spectator and commentator and offer ideas in the public square that then can be picked up if people like them.
I'm joining you in that joy, actually. After being an elected official from age 26 to 42, it's a bit nice to return to what Madison believed would be the highest role in our society, that of citizen. Dinesh D'Souza, thank you so much for your time. I could talk to you for another hour, but we should do it on your podcast where I've been a guest before and would be honored to be welcomed back.
I look forward to it, absolutely.
Take care, my friend.